The staff of Moses, it's planted in a single place. The community grows around that. That's the same as the magic wand of Gandalf. That idea of a magic wand. It's the traditional ethos associated with transformation and sacrifice around which communities aggregate themselves. And a proper humanities and religious education inculcates that center structure so that knowledge can be organized around it. The last time we talked, I suggested to you that we see the world through a biblical lens. Literally see it. I mean literally. It structures our perceptions. And I've investigated that far more deeply. And what seems to be the case with a corpus of stories like the biblical library is that if you know the stories, it structures your psyche so that you have a place to put information. And so that enables you to understand the current world and everything that's happening, but to place everything in the right context. And so the transmission of an unbroken cultural edifice, story-based edifice, is the manner in which you solve the alignment problem, unite your society, integrate your psyche, pursue what's meaningful, and protect yourself from chaos and anxiety. So, a solid education has been the traditional way of ensuring that that occurs. And so, well, that's what we hope we can offer with Peterson Academy. That's the purpose of my books as well, to elucidate that. And so, can the universities do that? I don't think so.
I don't know if they have that philosophy. The philosophy and the way you're laying it out resonates with me. I think it's accurate. I think it when I'm in harmony in my life, that it all seems to make sense. It all works together. Mm-hmm. What you're saying, it just rings true. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they're so infected with this ideology that flies in the face.
They've rejected it wholeheartedly.
Yes.
Look, the premise of the postmodernists is that there's no uniting meta-narrative. If you had to define postmodernism in one phrase, that would be it. And so what have they done? Here's the association with Marxism. Okay, so the Marxists have a counter-narrative. It's the narrative of power. And it is a very powerful counter-narrative, because if you don't put the proper uniting principle at the pinnacle, its power emerges immediately, because people play power games, and you can attain a certain degree of success and a fair amount of domination by playing a power game. And so Marx observed that one of the cardinal power games is economic. And it is probably the cardinal power game, right? There's economic disparity. Those at the top do take advantage of their position at the top to stabilize their position. Like in a functional society, productive people are at the top. But even among those at the top, there's still power-seeking crooks. Mm-hmm. And so now Marx, of course, would say that, well, everyone who's economically successful is a power-seeking crook. And, you know, that's a great thing to believe if you're a resentful Satanist like Marx.
Well, it's how the losers look at the world.
Well, that's for sure. But there is some justification in it, because among the successful there are...
Yes.
Right, okay.
And a large percentage, because that's the culture in which they're existing.
Yeah, well, a dangerous percentage.
Yes.
And a critique of power is always a valid critique. Okay, so what the postmodernists did when Marxism became ethically unacceptable, and that happened in the 1970s, is they metastasized it. They said, okay, we've got a victim-victimizer narrative that's played out in the economic sphere, and that's basically Marxism. We'll just multiply that until the same interpretive framework can be applied to all possible group distinctions. That's basically intersectionality. So sex is a oppressor versus oppressed narrative. Gender is an oppressed versus oppressor narrative. Ethnicity, race, ability, attractiveness, height. Any qualitative distinction is now recast as a battle between oppressor and oppressed. It's an unbelievably brutal story. It's basically equivalent to the claim that the spirit of power is the ruler of the cosmos.
How can they do all this and ignore the possibility of an oppressor, like a male, adopting the identity of the oppressed of a female and entering into female
Well,
spaces
you can
and
see
oppressing
how
females.
you can see that it can't be dealt with because
Wild, right?
Well,
that is wild.
Look, one of the things you see that's very characteristic of the utopian left is the absolute insistence that anyone oppressed is a victim. It's like, okay, we'll give the devil his due. Some oppressed people are victims, but some people who claim to be oppressed aren't victims. They're the worst kind of monsters that the most deranged imagination could barely conceptualize. Utopian, naive, radical progressives refuse their imagination for evil, and that delivers them into the hands of the absolute bloody psychopaths. Right? And they just don't see it. It's like, oh, those trans people, they're just striving to be free. It's like, you wait until you have one of them in your house, buddy, and you're going to find out just exactly how naive you are. So how do they protect themselves? They just deny the existence of malevolence or attribute it to socioeconomic inequality. All criminals are victims. It's like, no, first of all, lots of people who are victims aren't criminals. In fact, poverty does not cause criminality. That's a lie. And it's a very damaging lie to the poor. Because if poverty was equivalent to criminality, the logical thing to do is just to lock up all the poor. Right. Well, there are many pathways from poverty forward, and one of them is criminality, but you can say the same thing about wealth. So the idea, and that's basically a Marxist theory of causality, it's like, well, those people's oppression is what's causing their lack of law-abiding what conduct. It's like, no, wrong, seriously wrong, and dangerously wrong, and ridiculously naive. That's not how the world works at all.
Right, you're also, in a sense, you're encouraging this kind of behavior because you're not punishing people for it, because you're saying it's not their fault.
Or you're even valorizing it. Oh, you poor thing.
Right, and you're allowing more of it to take place.
Well, we know that, so the dark tetrad types, so those are the subclinical psychopaths. Okay, so they're psychopathic. That makes them predatory and parasitic. That's the definition of a psychopath. Okay, they're narcissistic. So what does that mean? They want unearned social status, right? They're Machiavellian. So what does that mean? It means that their use of language is subordinated to their demand for hedonistic gratification and power. So like you and I, in principle, we hope, we're trying to pursue a thread of conversation that leads to further development, let's say, for us and for the audience. But I could easily be in here thinking, okay, what the hell do I have to tell Joe to increase my social media status? Right? And to play this situation as a game to enhance my own status or to further my selfish desires. That's Machiavellian. That was the dark triad. And what further investigation revealed that you had to add an additional dimension to that to fully flesh out the picture. Sadism. What's that? Positive delight in the unnecessary misery of others. That's the dark tetrad types. Well, dark tetrad types portray themselves as victims, right? That's one of their Machiavellian strategies. So now your question is, well, how do we segregate the real victims, so to speak, from the false victims? And one of the answers to that is like, beware of those who claim victimization as a justification for their moral, what would you say, for their moral transgressions. I did this because I'm a victim. It's like, really? Really? That was your reason? Poor you. That's your story. You monster. There are no monsters. It's like, if you think there are no monsters, you're naive and willfully blind to the point of delusion and, what would you call it? What do they say? There are none so blind as those who will not see. That certainly applies on the malevolent side.
And then from the point of view of, if you're looking at the people that are committing crimes, there's the unfortunate reality that people mimic their environment. And if you grow up in an environment where there are no positive role models and you see nothing but rampant crime around you, even good people go down bad paths.
Okay, so antisocial personality is somewhat heritable. There is some familial transmission. There is a role played by fatherlessness in particular. And that's perhaps because fatherless boys tend to turn towards a gang orientation, and the gangs of adolescents have a short-term time horizon. So they future discount badly, and that produces a proclivity for short-term gratification, and that includes like idiot criminal behavior.
Right.
Yeah. So what you need in a father, you need someone who encourages intelligent, upward-aiming sacrifice and an orientation towards others and future development. Right? That's what the spirit of the father really does, is that encouragement. So, and that reward for delay of gratification. So that's another indication of the relationship between, say, upward striving, moral orientation and maturity. If you're mature, you can delay gratification. And what does that mean? It means you've integrated the future into your perceptions. Right, and that has to be socially scaffolded, especially for men. Women, they get initiated by nature. In every society that we know of, men have to be initiated. Right, because that catalyzation of maturity is a difficult thing. Difficult and unlikely, but possible and necessary.
So how do you reach the people that are young adolescents that are trapped in that vicious cycle?
Yeah, well, I think I can tell you the answer to that. You know, a lot of young men have been watching and listening to the sorts of things that I've been writing about and producing. And every time someone comes up to me and tells me that reading, say, 12 Rules for Life had helped them, I ask why. It's like, okay, good. What changed? And the overwhelming pattern of response is something like, I started to understand the necessity of responsibility. Now, you might then ask, well, you hear from your parents, in principle, you hear from the school system, although that's probably gone, that, you should grow up and be responsible. Why did it make a difference? Why did it make a difference to you to read that in what I wrote? And the answer is, I didn't take the standard conservative approach. I didn't say, you should, you must, you ought, even though those things are true. I said, there's no difference between responsibility and adventure. That's a killer thing to know. The heavier the responsibility, the more profound the adventure. And so everyone knows that, but it's not catalyzed, eh?
Right.
So I just watched The Hobbit a while back, classic adventure story. And of course, it's Bilbo, to begin with, it's Bilbo. He's this little hobbit, right? Sort of like Abraham. He's living his comfortable life, and the wizard comes along and says, it's time for you to develop your shadow side, because, of course, he becomes a thief, and to go on your adventure. And he agrees to do that. And it's a weighty adventure. He has to contend with the ring of power. Right, that's the ultimate in temptations. That's the temptation that Christ is offered by Satan in the desert, the temptation of power. And that's the temptation that Bilbo has to contend with. Well, he has this adventure. Well, what's the adventure? It's responsibility. He has to carry that ring. And it is one of the rings that unites everything, power. It's just the malevolent ring that unites everything. And so I've been suggesting to young men in particular, it's like, you want to get your life together? Take the path of maximal responsibility. Not because you should, even though you should. That's not why. It's because that's the pathway of maximal adventure. So you say, well, what's the meaning of life? It's like, it's the meaning that reveals itself when you take the pathway of maximal responsibility. That's exactly the message of the crucifixion. That's precisely the message. Pathway of maximal responsibility. And that's a terrifying thing. There's no difference between that and the dragon and treasure stories that are, unbelievably archaic. The greatest possible treasure is to be found where the danger is most intense.
Right.
Yeah. Always.
Right. The dragon guards the gold.
Always.
Right.
Well, and so one thing to know is that if there's a dragon, there's a treasure somewhere.